When I was in school, I was generally not a very good math student. It didn't come naturally to me. Something about this right brain, left brain thing, and the connections weren't always that good. I struggled. I struggled particularly with long division, and then later I struggled with algebra. But curiously, despite my sometimes having some problems, when we got to geography, geography is an entirely different field. I'm pretty good at that too. But when we got to geometry, I suddenly found that I was like a savant. It all made sense to me. All of this figuring of triangles and angles and tangents and cotangents and sines and all these things, that they somehow just made sense. And I went back and took some remedial algebra and got some help from a college professor at Gustavus to master it, because I needed to know algebra better to solve the equations that somehow made sense to me in geometry. Now, of course, I was dealing at that time with plane geometry, which means like a flat surface. And you might remember, those of you who still can, your lessons in geometry, you have the y-axis that goes vertically and the x-axis that goes horizontally. You can always remember, y points to the sky, if you can't remember which one is which. And then I was just amazed when I discovered there was also a z quantity. So you not only had x and y, but z measured the distance above, like the altitude above sea level. And then many years later, I ended up, curiously enough, as a land surveyor, and all of my geometry came back into sharp focus, except now I had to expand it into something called spherical geometry. Because yes, much as I wish the world was flat, I can prove to you as a land surveyor it's not, and so you have to figure out how to do all of this on a spherical shape. And calculus has to come into all this to figure out the area and distances under the arc. And then I got into college. And while I was in college, I tried to study physics, and again, I struggled, because there was a part of physics that just didn't quite connect. And they introduced something else that blew my mind. I had gotten perfectly comfortable with all aspects of x and y and z. But they told me there's another dimension. Horizontal, vertical, the altitude, 3 dimensions, a 4th dimension to my world that's just as important as the other 3. Time. Time was the 4th dimension that they introduced into this equation. And now things really get interesting. Because you see, you can plot out your x, y, z point, but by the time you get to where that point is, the Earth has moved, because time has passed and it's not there anymore. This is the big problem they have, by the way, figuring out all the complex geometry and keeping communication satellites in one place, because everything's moving and the satellite has to move with it or things don't line up anymore. And when they were explaining to me the importance of this 4th dimension, and they usually think of it as 3 dimensions plus 1, that aspect of time, what happens in that dimension of time is change. We all change constantly. Every single solitary second and millisecond of our lives, we are constantly in change. New cells are being born, old cells die, synapses change, we lose a few, we pick up a few, we learn something new, we forget something that we thought would be with us forever. We're constantly changing. And not only do we change in terms of our physical selves, the actual substance, but we change in our understanding of the world. Things that once didn't make sense begin to make more sense to us. Or things that we thought we understood completely, we learn that we really don't understand at all. That 4th dimension, that aspect of change, suddenly is introduced into our world. And nothing is ever the same. Nothing is ever the same twice. Nothing can truly be repeated because it has changed. It has changed over time. It has changed whether we noticed or not. When we hear the prologue to the fourth evangelist, the book of the Gospels we call John, he wrestles in these first 18 verses of the first chapter with that very fourth dimension, with that change that occurs, with that change that occurs over time, and also with the change that doesn't happen. Those first words of this readings from the fourth evangelist echo the first words of the book of Genesis. In the beginning. In the beginning. John is somewhat like Mark. We've been hearing Mark's gospel, and if you remember in Mark's account, there is no nativity, there is no birth narrative, there is no looking back. In Mark's gospel, we just sort of start with John the Baptist crying out in the wilderness, and suddenly, boom, Jesus gets baptized and we're off to the races. Matthew and Luke take us back. Matthew gives us wonderful things. Joseph has dreams. Magi, wise men from the east, show up at the manger following a star. And in Luke, of course, we know that story by heart. All the world to be enrolled, and Joseph to the city of Bethlehem, and the time came for his wife to have her baby. And we sang with the angels again this morning. But John doesn't give us that. John doesn't give us that. He doesn't just go back to before Jesus was born. He goes back to before the world was born. And he tells us that this wonderful being, this child of God who was coming into the world, who came into the world, this child of God who changed everything, has been here from the beginning. He was in the world before we were, and not one thing was created without him. And John chooses an interesting title for this second person of the Godhead, the Word. If you noticed in your bulletin, Word was capitalized. The W was a capital W. The Word came. The Word was coming into the world. Interesting choice. In the Greek, the original Greek, the word is logos, from which we get our English word logic. It's that capacity of reason, the thing that separates us from almost all the other creatures, the ability to problem solve, to figure things out, to be creative, to be inventive, to have all of the wonderful things that we enjoy. Gifts of God, to be sure, but gifts of our minds, of our creative ability. That's the part within us, that reasoning, that problem solving, that creativity. That's a great piece of what it means to be created in the image of God. But what does it mean to say that the logos, the reasoning part of God, if you will, the mind of God, was coming into the world? It was an opportunity to now know the mind of God in flesh and blood in the person of Jesus. Nothing more profound, nothing more amazing has ever happened in the history of our universe. The mind of God, the full knowledge of God, the full intellectual being of God was born, a tiny baby just like the rest of us, in a little stable, in a little town called Bethlehem, a backwater of the Roman Empire, to be sure. And this little baby would grow and mature, and when this little baby taught, when he grew up and taught us, he taught us from the mind of God. Throughout all the Gospels, we hear how he spoke with such power and such authority. Well, why not? It was God talking to us directly. Not God sending down stone tablets, not God whispering in the ear of Moses about what to tell the children of Israel, not God inspiring and pushing the prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Hosea and Amos and Daniel and all the others, not that to put some bug in their ear to tell us what God wanted us to know. God was talking to us directly. God was talking to us from God's heart, from God's mind, from God's very essence, from God's logos. And the mind of God became flesh and lived among us, full of grace and truth. One of my seminary professors was fond of saying, if you can't get your congregation to read the New Testament the way you want them to, make them keep reading the first 18 verses of the first chapter of John's Gospel over and over and over and over until they get it. And once they get those first 18 verses of John's Gospel, the rest is easy. The rest comes naturally. Because John encapsulates all that God did in what we heard this morning. But it would take us a lifetime to unpack it all. God as the Word, the Logos, God in the flesh among us, God full of grace and truth, God who was bringing life, and that life was the light of the world. There's an hour-long sermon in every one of those phrases. There's months of study. There's months of reflection in almost every one of those words. But I talked about change. And I talked about time. And what has happened since that morning in Bethlehem, since that morning that we heard that baby cry for the first time, since that morning when the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, this old world has been spinning by and changing and wobbling and cycling, and all of us with it. And we have been changed in our very essence of being because the Word became flesh. From that moment on, not only did the mind of God come into that one little baby in Bethlehem, the mind and the heart and the power and the light and the life of God came into all things in the created world. When the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, all creation began to change and was transformed. All creation now was there, inside the Logos, inside the mind of God. If only we knew it. If only we could accept it. If only our feeble brains could wrap themselves around it. It was all laid out for us. And we were changed. And we are changed. And we are changing. Every minute, every second, every nanosecond. The mind of God and the heart of God and the beauty and the truth of God that dwells within us is transforming us and making us holy. A process our siblings in the Eastern Orthodox Church call sanctification. We are becoming more and more and more holy, whether we know it or not, whether we try it or not, whether we do anything about it or not. Because that fourth dimension of the time that has passed, not only from the star above the manger in Bethlehem, but from when the Logos created everything that is and would ever be, has been constantly changing, constantly reaching out, constantly calling to us, constantly nudging us, constantly making us over into something purer and more holy and more beautiful and more wonderful. Oh, sometimes we fight against it and we do the most awful things to one another. We say and do and think the most awful things. But that doesn't mean that God is not continuing to try to change that course of our heart and our mind and our soul. God is still healing us and renewing us and making us even more perfect because of God's love and God's light and God's truth and God's grace. We can't wrap our minds around it. We can't wrap our minds around the fact that this is a God who never gives up and never gives in. A God who is unchanging in God's self, but is changing every single solitary atom in our body and our mind and our spirit. Out of love. Out of pure love. God wants us to change for the better. To walk toward the light, to walk toward the life, to walk toward the grace, to walk toward the Word. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen His glory, if only we can wrap our mind around it.